Okay, great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm seeing a lot of friendly faces on the line, and it's always great to bring folks together at the I guess, kind of public deep dive into a study like this, which is just so valuable. A lot of you will know that this is our biggest impact performance study to date, or two of them, I guess, suppose. This reflects 2 years, or over 2 years at this point, of really deep learning across the GIIN and across the industry as a whole. And we're really excited to be chatting with you all a little bit more deeply about what we learned in the process. I do want to just take a moment up front and recognize a number of people and organizations who have been really instrumental to the development and launch of these studies. First and kind of closest to me are our partners and collaborators, CERES and the International Labor Organization and ITC-ILO, as well as a number of you and others who were a part of really developing the IRIS Plus themes on these topics. You helped us lay the groundwork for these efforts. Also want to recognize participants in these 2 studies, these 2 impact performance studies, who gave us the data and the insights necessary to do these analyses. My fellow GIIN colleagues, Ben Ringel, Sophia Sunderji, Rachel Bass, and Dean Hand, who led this study just so thoughtfully and with such great rigor. And then finally, our external speakers, who are Emily Simso from New Forests and Bervi Shavia from HCAP, who are going to bring it to life in this conversation. A couple of housekeeping notes up front, and we can switch to the agenda slide if we can. First is just that Rachel Bass is our questions lead and has also been a thinking partner and lead behind a lot of this work. She is going to rename herself questions lead here. And so if, as we're going along, you wouldn't mind directing your questions to her, she'll make sure that we can see them and incorporate them in the Q&A at the end of the talk. We are recording this conversation and we're going to post it on the IRIS Plus webinars page. So if you are excited about sharing it with someone who wasn't able to join us, you'll be able to do it there. And we'll ask everybody to stay on mute as we're going along, just to preserve the sound quality for that recording. We can move forward. I'm gonna try to zoom in here a little bit. So the GIIN operates and really drives towards a world in which investors integrate impact into investment decisions. Just by default. And the reason that we're doing these studies and having this conversation today is because that the impact performance analytics and insights that we're driving through these studies are really critical to that vision. On the next slide, the way that we do that, and one of our main objectives in driving towards that goal, is this kind of loop between these 2 pieces. So as we're generating impact performance insights to demonstrate how to think about impact performance in the context of investments, we're also driving towards ongoing learning and iteration, both in the process and in the outputs. And I think you'll see some of that in what we present today. When we think about these studies, there's the obvious question, why now? Why did we think about doing this in this particular moment? There are so many things to be working on in impact and investing. Part of the reason is that the market is growing so rapidly right now. And as the market gets bigger, and we're really excited about that, it's becoming difficult sometimes to see who in the industry is really focused on and driving great impact. We're also seeing a lot of changes and increasing pressures in regulatory bodies and standards. Some of them specific geographies, some of them much broader. And then of course, all of this is against a backdrop of some really pretty big systemic issues. We're seeing large scale natural disasters and climate change and deepening social inequities. I was thinking about these talking points and reflecting on a comment that my colleague Dean Hand made in a recent blog post, and I'll just read it quickly because I think it makes the point really beautifully. It's true that around COP26, an inspiring level of commitments to climate finance were announced. This is nothing new. And it's nothing but posturing if it doesn't translate into tangible action. And that, I think, beautifully summarizes why impact performance data is really so critical. On the next slide, as I mentioned, the GIIN works really hard to continually learn and grow as we're building out some of these components. And I just wanted to visually illustrate how that works. As many of you know, because you've been a part of this process, IRIS Plus and the theme development process is how we build and offer standard metrics and data standards to the industry. And after the IRIS standards are published, this team, which is brilliant and super thoughtful, builds an analytic pilot, inviting investors to submit data on their impact performance and analyzing it according to COMPASS, which is, of course, the methodology for comparing and analyzing impact performance information. And then that sets a foundation for actionable performance analytics tools or analysis tools. And is a way of just kind of illustrating this ongoing learning and build. An example of that actionable performance analysis tool would be the financial inclusion benchmark that we'll be launching later, I think in March, actually. And throughout that entire process, we are kind of building feedback loops, testing with those of you in the industry who are actively doing this work through your investments and your broader efforts, and kind of co-building feedback into the entire system. And with that, I'll pass the word over to Sophia, who will take us a little bit deeper into everything that they've uncovered.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Lissa. And thank you to everyone who's here today for joining us in this discussion on impact performance. As Lissa mentioned, my name is Sophia Sunderji, and I sit on the research team at the GIIN. And I have the privilege today of sharing with all of you some of our latest work on understanding the impact performance of investments, specifically within mitigating climate change and supporting quality jobs. And so with that, the focus of our findings today is really on what investors can do with impact data and really making sense of impact results in a way that is both meaningful and contextualized. We'll get to hear from two leading impact investors on how they're using impact data to ultimately manage toward greater impact performance really within their own portfolios. And so the GIIN's impact performance studies have each had a different either sector or theme as the focal point. And in the past, as you know, we've covered financial inclusion, agriculture, clean energy, housing. And so this year's focus for the studies was really on climate change mitigation and quality jobs. And I'll walk you through right now just an overview of the research process before really getting into the findings. We undertook a pretty engaging research approach, building the performance studies alongside a group of leaders and participants, including a lot of you in the room today. We designed two questionnaires, one for each theme, alongside the development of the IRIS Plus themes for climate change mitigation and quality jobs. And so the metrics that we've used in both studies are based on those core metric sets that are backed, as you know, by evidence and aligned with third-party standards. In this case, the ILO standards and the GHG protocol. We then went out to the market and to many of you and collected annualized data at the investment level from impact investors that are focused on jobs or climate or both, from about May of last year until September. We then ran analysis and really looked at how impact investments are performing when it comes to impact, and especially progress towards some of the biggest challenges around climate and employment in our time. What I'll draw your attention to here is really the role of COMPASS, as Lissa mentioned earlier, the methodology for comparing and assessing impact performance. And for a little bit of background context, this is the methodology that the GIIN put out almost a year ago now and was built in conjunction with over 300 stakeholders globally. And so this approach that you see here on the screen, assessing outcomes, normalizing impact results, or in other words, looking at investment-weighted impact, and then generating analytic figures has really laid the foundation for this impact performance research. But what's really incredible is that together, these efforts are laying the foundation for the industry's first impact performance benchmark, and we'll hear a little bit more on that towards the end. But with that, what I'll highlight right now is 3 key learnings from our research on impact performance that we know will be critical for all impact investors moving forward. And so the first key learning here is really that there are a variety of ways to understand and to unpack impact performance. And what's been especially insightful really throughout this entire process or journey in learning about performance is that each angle can tell a pretty different story. But ultimately, looking at impact as change over time is really the crux of impact performance. And so what we know is that a lot of investors tend to look at impact at a point in time, looking at the scale of impact. So for example, the number of GHG emissions released in 2020. But what we've learned is that what really matters is looking at change over time. So for example, that change in emissions between 2019 and 2020. Within that, there are 2 different components that we've been looking at in this research in impact performance. The actual volume or amount of change. So for example, a 250 metric ton increase in emissions as compared to the previous year. Or the percent change as we see here at the bottom. So a 6.4% decrease in scope 1 emissions. Now, looking at impact at a point in time can be really useful to provide baseline data and help investors understand really what that starting point is. But understanding impact performance over time is really what impact performance is all about. And I know that many of you on the line are already starting to think about your impact of your own investments and portfolios as sort of a change over time figure. So we'd invite you to share your own thoughts about how you're thinking about this and approaching this in the chat or during the Q&A in a little bit. The second reflection that we'll share is the role of the investment and the investor. And what's been especially enlightening about this year's impact performance studies is that we actually explore investment level impact results for the first time. And this is in alignment with that Compass methodology. And so really moving here from company or investee results to investment results. Along with that, we've also been exploring how investors are influencing and really contributing to impact results through the timing, terms, and engagement of their capital. I think inherent in here is that feedback loop that helps illustrate how investors can make choices and decisions that really influence outcomes. And it presents a massive opportunity for investors to think about how to critically use various mechanisms and levers to ultimately manage towards greater impact. I will say that this certainly requires understanding the nature of the relationship between some of these investor strategies and the actual impact results. And there's lots of research to do on this front still, but we of course invite stakeholders in the industry at large to take that on. And then lastly, our third and final sort of overarching key learning or key finding is probably an unsurprising one to pretty much everyone here. I think the reality is that there is so much more progress that's needed to tackle climate change and support quality jobs globally. And so in this research, we look at the progress that's been made so far across a sample of investments relative to the change that's actually needed. You can see a couple of examples here on the screen, and we'll go into them in detail in just a few minutes. But on the climate side, what we see is that investments in the sample reduced their scope 1 emissions by about 6.4% compared to the previous year, which sounds fantastic. But when we compare that to the 7.6% decrease that's needed annually, it's clear just how much more work we have left to do as as an impact investing community, but also broader than that. On the quality job side, we looked at gender wage equity among investments in the sample in comparison to the ideal complete gender equity when it comes to wages. And we similarly see that opportunity for progress. And so on that note, we'll go ahead and share just some of those top line impact performance findings from each report, and we'll be asking our speakers to jump in here in a few minutes as well. But as we're going through the impact results, we'll ask you to keep those 3 concepts or key learnings in mind. Impact as change over time, the role of the investor in contributing to results, and then the progress that's actually needed to solve some of these global challenges. And really think about how those concepts might relate to your own work in managing impact. So kicking off with impact performance in climate change mitigation. Everyone on this call knows so well the dire situation that we're in when it comes to our climate crisis, and really the immeasurable risk that our planet is at, and just the sheer scale of human lives and communities and societies that are at risk because of our crisis, and because of the role that we as humans play in it. But we also know that progress can be made, and impact investments can play a really critical role in that. As we know, ultimately what we need is a 7.6% annual reduction in emissions to meet that 1.5 degrees Celsius target that's been set out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And so in this research, we looked at a small but meaningful set of investments that are seeking to mitigate climate change, really to understand impact performance at the investment level. And if we go to the next slide, what we'll see is that most investors that participated in this climate change mitigation study are based in developed markets, and the vast majority that participated were asset managers, managing about 750 million assets on average, and closer to about 150 million at the median. Unsurprisingly, most investments in the sample were made through either private debt or private equity, followed closely, I think, by real assets. And investments included were made most commonly within sustainable agriculture and clean energy. And so we can see reflected there just some of those sectors that are really critical when it comes to mitigating climate change. What we see across this sample of impact investments is pretty significant progress. Number one, investees in the sample decreased their Scope 1 emissions by 6.4% per year. But of course, as we've talked about already, that does leave a significant gap to the 7.6% annual decrease that's actually required. Secondly, across annualized investments that are specifically focused on clean energy, a given investee generated about 2.9 million kilowatt hours of renewable energy on average each year. And to help contextualize that a little bit, that's equivalent to replacing almost 5,000 barrels of annual oil consumption, which really does highlight the meaningful contribution that this sample of investments has made towards accelerating clean energy solutions. Third, investments focused on nature-based solutions sequestered about 3.2 million metric tons of emissions on average each year, which again reflects that significant real-world impact through forestry and agriculture. And then fourth and finally, thinking back to that concept of impact as a unit or figure of change over time, the number of decent jobs supported each year increased by 28% on average at investees with some type of climate strategy in place. There's lots more in the report, so definitely feel free to take a look and learn more. But with that, I will stop talking, and I'm very delighted to introduce Emily Simso, Sustainability Manager at New Forests, which is an impact investing organization focused on forestry, land management, and conservation. And Emily has done all kinds of incredible work on greenhouse gas accounting, looking at emissions and removals at New Forests. And she'll be sharing with us some insights on not only their GHG investor tool, but once you have that impact data, what do you do with it? And so with that, over to you, Emily.
Great, thanks, Sophia. I'm excited to be here with you all today and share some thoughts around greenhouse gas accounting sort of broadly, and also how we've decided to tackle this process. So if you could just move to the next slide, please. Just really quickly, brief context about New Forests. We're a global sustainable forestry and sustainable land use investment manager, founded in 2005 and headquartered in Sydney. And we have about 7.7 billion in Australian dollars in assets under management, which represents approximately 1.1 million hectares. And this is spread across our investment strategies in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. So just quickly, backing up a little bit, why does greenhouse gas accounting matter? And of course, this is a much larger conversation, but just some key points that we thought about throughout this process. Historically, greenhouse gas accounting really focused on the emissions side. And, we're seeing this shifting a little bit over time, but that's really where we're starting from. And as this has been emerging, different investors and, asset managers are looking to use a standardized approach for their accounting methodology, which then encourages comparability. And we're seeing that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is emerging as the leader in this space with their scopes 1, 2, and 3 approach. And, once you're measuring something, that increases transparency around it once you're also reporting, and that allows for more action and ambition around high emitting sectors and other companies and climate action more broadly. And so we believe while there's been a lot of great progress around the emission side of greenhouse gas accounting, we also need to start thinking about removals, which is the other side of that coin, which we see as a key tool to help scale natural climate solutions, particularly around forestry and land use. And this comprehensive accounting, emissions and removals, is what we need to also meet net zero commitments that are emerging, across all sectors, and also climate action pledges that have been made. We need that full picture of ambition. And, at New Forests, we're very committed to this idea of having comprehensive accounting, and it's part of our broader climate action plan. Just go to the next slide, thank you. Of course, there are a range of challenges associated with supporting scaling forestry investment through comprehensive greenhouse gas accounting. And sort of the first bucket of those challenges lays within the accounting framework itself. So we believe one of the key things that needs to happen is for an increased recognition and greater encouragement of increasing carbon stocks on land. And doing that through an approach that focuses on, net carbon changes or the flux rather than just gross emissions and removals. We believe this will promote, greater climate benefits and scale investment into these spaces at a greater pace. We also need more straightforward boundary setting approaches and reporting requirements. There's a lot out there, so to also encourage comparability and transparency, we just need more straightforward guidance. Another piece of this is that we need new reporting categories if we're also going to add removals to this accounting framework. So thinking about the best way to also communicate removals categories through accounting. Another issue that comes up a lot for the forestry sector is how do we incorporate the carbon storage benefits in harvested wood products, particularly that long-term carbon storage benefit. At New Forests, we think that this is really central to climate targets and goals, and that putting these carbon storage benefits within the scope of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is really critical to scaling understanding in this space. And also, thinking about substitution benefits and everything that, harvested wood products can offer us when you're replacing something more intensive, such as cement or steel. So getting greater awareness around that as well. As we develop these new frameworks and tools, we need to be thinking about emissions and removals on a like-for-like basis, sort of a balance sheet, if you will, for greenhouse gas accounting, which would be a bit of a different approach than how we've been taking it in the past. And throughout all of these, topics, there have been various challenges and opposition along the way. there's a lack of a standardized approach for forestry investment managers and investors, which can lead to criticisms around reporting. There's also, there tends to be a lack of belief in the validity of the data for carbon storage around harvested wood products. So we need to have, again, a more standardized approach that's easily communicated and shows robust science. There also can be over-conservatism around the permanence of these carbon stocks in forests and harvested wood products, which can decrease the climate benefits that are perceived, kind of having this perverse effect of reducing the investment in natural capital solutions and the circular bioeconomy. So we want to make sure that our reporting methodologies are accurate, based off ground truthing and best available science. And that's a lot of information, that's a lot to process. And there's so many things going on in this space that at the end of the day, it's also just challenging to develop and resource a greenhouse gas accounting framework that meets the needs of your organization and assets under management. So we go to the next slide. How we tackled this process was we set out to have a project that would measure our scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions across our corporate operations and also all of our investments under management. And we lined this up with the greenhouse gas protocol. Our journey actually began in 2014 when we began reporting our carbon storage data publicly. But it wasn't until 2020 that we were able to actually develop our carbon emissions inventory. And we started with doing scopes 1, 2, and 3 for our corporate operations and scopes 1 and 2 for our investments under management, because we knew scope 3 was going to be more of a challenge and we wanted to make sure that we gave it the time and consideration that it needed. And in 2020, we were able to collect our FY20 data, which serves as our baseline moving forward. And this was published in our 2020 sustainability report. In September to November of 2021, we were able to develop our scope 3 investments methodology, and that's across all of our regions and different asset types under management. And we went through our first data collection process for that at the end of last year. And we're excited to share that for our upcoming 2021 sustainability report, it will include our comprehensive accounting of emissions removals and storage, using that sort of balance sheet approach, if you will, to see how our emissions and removals compare. Next slide, please. So what does this actually look like? It's an Excel-based tool where we send individual collection spreadsheets to our third-party property managers and investee companies. They add the primary data to that workbook, kilowatt hours of energy, gallons of fuel used, and send that back to us. We then input it into our tool that converts that primary data into emissions data and visualizes, our breakdown of scopes 1, 2, and 3, and helps us compare emission sources and amounts across regions and asset types. Next slide, please. So what's next for New Forests? As I mentioned, we'll be publishing our carbon emissions and removals data in our 2021 sustainability report. And alongside that, we'll have a public disclosure that outlines our methodology in more detail. We'll also continue to support the update to the greenhouse gas protocol focused on land sector guidance and removals. And throughout this, we're also trying to adapt and adopt so that we have a more sophisticated data collection methodology, perhaps moving away from Excel spreadsheets that better fits into our business operations. And in 2022, we're excited to use all of this data to inform our net zero target setting, fund level emission reduction plans, and science-based targets for our business and investments. And of course, continuously learning and improving in this space as more information and tools become available. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing New Forest's journey with us. My name is Ben Ringel. I'm a senior associate on the research team here at the GIIN, and I have the pleasure of walking through some key findings from the Understanding Impact Performance study in quality jobs. The importance of investing in quality jobs is clearer than ever in light of disruptions caused by in light of disruptions to the global workforce caused by COVID-19. Even before the pandemic, 2 billion workers, making up over 60% of the world's employed population, were informally employed. Further, many workers struggle to find safe employment, as 3 million people die each year of work-related injuries. It's always important to consider gender dynamics when looking at quality jobs investments. Globally, healthy working-age men are employed at a much higher rate, 71%, than healthy working-age women, only 45%. With this context in mind, the GIIN's report on understanding impact performance and quality jobs analyzed 867 annualized investments to raise key insights on progress towards many aspects of quality jobs. Investors in the sample were more often headquartered in developed rather than emerging markets, and the average investor managed $735 million compared to $116 million at the median. Looking at investees in the sample, a majority, 52%, were growth stage organizations. It's also important to consider sector of investment, as quality jobs investments can take place and are very important in all sectors across the board. The most common sectors of investment in this sample include food and agriculture, financial services, and microfinance. Investors in the sample were able to report on several impact metrics that allowed us at the research team to analyze and compare impact performance in a standardized way. What I'll share today are 4 key findings from that analysis. The first key finding has to do with improved career progression opportunities. Specifically, the delivery of skill-building trainings or mentorship opportunities has grown 18% year over year among full-time permanent staff receiving trainings. Improvement in job skills is critical to improved career progression opportunities, and this analysis shows the utility of using change over time to illustrate the direction and momentum of impact. The second key finding focuses on improved occupational safety. Across the sample, only 17% of investees provided health and safety training, maintained health and safety policies, and implemented employee feedback and grievance mechanisms. This demonstrates a clear opportunity for increased focus on improved occupational safety globally and both across high and low risk sectors. Our third key finding has to do with reducing gender inequality. The gender wage equity ratio across the entire sample was 0.95, although across the subset of investees with anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies in place, that figure was 1.01. Once adjusted for differences in work and job characteristics, the gender wage gap sits at 0.98 globally. As a result, while investments in the broader sample are underperforming relative to that benchmark, those with anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies in place outperform the global average. And lastly, our final key finding focuses on improving incomes. An average of 796 staff were paid at least a living wage, representing 73% of their investees' average total employee base. By another interpretation, this means that 27% of employees at investee organizations were not paid a living wage. This presents significant opportunity for investors to focus on ensuring that each employee at their investee organizations are paid a living wage. And with that, I now have the pleasure of introducing Bhairavi Shavdia, a principal at HCAP Partners, to speak about HCAP's commitment to promoting quality jobs through its investments. So Bhairavi, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Ben, and I'm excited to be here and share with this group our work at HCAP Partners and the journey we've had to develop our quality jobs platform. If we can move to the next slide, please. Right, so HCAP Partners is a private equity firm. We're focused on the lower middle market in the United States, and we're investing in businesses that have typically 1 to 5 million in EBITDA. We've developed a quality jobs platform that we call the gainful jobs approach. And a majority of our portfolio is our companies that we consider underserved. So these are companies that are either located in low to moderate income area census tracts or employ a majority of the workforce that is low to moderate income wage earning. HCAP was founded in 2000, and since then we've had a journey to get to sort of where we are now with our quality jobs approach. When we first started, we were really focused on job creation, and although that is a metric that we do look at today, we've evolved since then. We went from job creation to sort of, internally building out a collection mechanism for data and metrics analysis to really look at a greater detail around, who was filling the jobs that were being created, wage data, demographic data, to then, really having a pivot to say, we can look at job creation, but we want to ensure that the jobs that are being created in our portfolio and the existing jobs in our portfolio are quality jobs. And that was a big change for us in our impact evolution, and led to the creation of our impact platform, which is called the Gainful Jobs Approach. Underlining all of this is our belief that investing in human capital is critical to successful business outcomes and improved financial performance. And so the Gainful Jobs approach really is a two-part approach. The first is a robust quantitative measurement system, which really helps to assess existing job quality standards at time of investment. And then the second part of that is really active portfolio engagement to identify and implement workplace initiatives with the real intention of creating and maintaining high quality jobs. As our impact approach continues to strengthen, we are taking a greater look at aligning our exits with our impact thesis. And we've done so through the use of what we are calling carrot agreements, which I'll touch on a little bit later on. If we can move to the next page, please. So, what does our methodology look like around engaging with our portfolio? So, at investment, we have a portion of our diligence, which we title as impact diligence, and that really informs a baseline assessment. And so, we work with our prospective portfolio company leadership to understand the current job quality standards. We'll often integrate into the HR systems of our portfolio companies so that we can pull data at a per employee level. And I think, that's something that we've learned has been really helpful for us, given that we're investing in smaller businesses. And, much of this is around sort of removing the data burden and really having the ability to sort of have the bandwidth of our portfolio companies focus in on implementing the policies and benefits that are needed to improve job quality standards. Once we have the baseline assessment in place, we'll work hand in hand with management teams to create a strategic roadmap. And that strategic roadmap is a 3 to 5 year roadmap with goals around job quality improvement. And this is a condition to close for us. And so it really shows sort of values alignment with our management teams, because without sort of a strategic roadmap in place, we won't fund deals. And then there's sort of a continuous feedback loop post-close. So we require reporting on the Gainful Jobs approach to be part of the board reporting packages. So they're discussed at every board meeting we attend. There are quarterly check-ins around progress towards goals, areas where we can help with. We often find ourselves working hand in hand with our portfolio companies to, put the right tools and resources in place to further improve job quality. Moving on to the next slide. This is just an overview here of the themes that we look at HCAP when we're thinking through what a quality job entails. So they're in 3 different themes. The first is economic opportunity, and within that we're looking at broad-based participation, essentially sort of wealth creation mechanisms outside of income. We also look at opportunities for advancement, and so here the idea is that if you can you, is there a career progression ladder? Is there a path to sort of, start on the sort of maybe factory floor, then go into the sales team, and then move up into management? And we're also looking at education benefits that are offered. Sustainable livelihood is really looking at the provision of a living wage. Then we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this has been a recent addition to our framework. And so, we're looking at DEI policies, and we're also looking at sort of DEI across the management staff and at the board level. And then health and wellness. So this is, paid sick leave, including parental leave, and then wellness initiatives. Embedded into all of this is a strong worker voice component. We directly survey each one of the employees at our portfolio companies to get their feedback on if the goals in the strategic roadmap are resonating. Moving on to the next slide. So this is a case study of one of our portfolio companies that we exited in December 2020, and really kind of highlights some of the metrics that we look at when we're thinking about quality jobs, both sort of at a point in time and over time, as well as sort of the implementation of a carrot agreement, which I touched on earlier. So, a carrot agreement was our way of thinking through a more equitable exit and ensuring that, the low to moderate income wage earning staff benefited from, our exit, assuming that we at HCAP reached a certain financial hurdle or threshold. And so essentially the carrot agreement is a pool of capital that's funded at exit. Funding comes from both HCAP and then the management or the ownership of the company we're exiting. And that funding is sort of granted if HCAP achieves a certain financial threshold. And so with Confirmed Biosciences, we were able to put in place a carrot agreement. Also alongside sort of the financial threshold, there's also a need for our portfolio company to have shown a meaningful improvement in job quality standards. And so, here for Confirmed Biosciences, 100% of the jobs were improved during our investment period, with an average number of 3.2 improvements per job. And the carrot agreement here was a bonus pool that was created for employees, low to moderate income earning employees that did not have stock options in the company. And so when the company was sold, there was a transaction bonus that was given to each low to moderate income wage earning staff, which was around $13,000 per employee. So, a meaningful way to make sure that we're thinking around, quality jobs, not only at investment and throughout investment, but as we exit as well. So I think that's it for HCAP. I'll turn it back to Ben.
Thank you so much, Bhairavi. I find it so interesting and inspiring to hear about HCAP's gainful jobs approach, along with many other measures you're taking, like carrot agreements, to further quality employment at your investee organizations. So we'll begin our Q&A soon. So this is a final reminder to please direct your questions to our questions lead in the chat. Beforehand, I'll quickly run through a few key learnings from the quality jobs and climate change mitigation studies and discuss a few next steps for the GIIN and the impact industry. Through these studies, we've drawn 3 key lessons. First, change over time is the crux of impact. Second, investors can leverage strategies and engagement mechanisms to influence impact results, but more learning is needed to understand these linkages. And finally, while investors have made some progress, significantly more is needed to address climate solutions and quality jobs. The GIIN has many exciting initiatives in the works to meet the current needs of the market. Our first impact performance benchmark focused on financial inclusion will be launching in March. This product goes even further in allowing for comparability of impact performance, providing an interactive dashboard through which investors can explore aggregate impact performance and see how they are performing relative to their peers and to the industry. Please keep an eye out for our launch next month, and when the time comes, please consider contributing data to this effort. The only way we're able to present these insights are because investors like yourselves have contributed their impact data. So to those of you who have done so in the past, a heartfelt thank you from those of us at the GIIN. And for those who are considering contributing your data, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions you may have. Myself and my colleagues' emails will be on the next slide, so you'll be able to use that contact information if you wish. IRIS Plus is continuing to promote standardization and target setting and transparency and impact reporting. One big effort the GIIN is working on this year is the IRIS Plus list, an interactive database that allows investors of all kinds to discover their peers and be discovered by the market. The list will raise important market insights based on impact performance. Additionally, the GIIN is building out a new theme in the IRIS Plus system, specifically on climate change adaptation and resilience. We're excited to work with industry leaders to promote this important theme. And we ask that if you're interested in participating either in this theme development or the IRIS Plus list, again, please reach out to myself or my colleagues. Our emails will be up shortly. With that, we'll turn it over to our Q&A. I'd like to thank you all once again for joining the session. Thank you to Bervi and Emily for sharing your stories with us. And thank you to our participants from these studies who really made it possible. Both understanding impact performance studies, quality jobs, and climate change mitigation can be found on the GIIN website if you'd like to learn more. And with that, I'll hand it back to my colleague Sophia to lead us through Q&A.
Great. Well, thanks, Ben, and a big thanks to everyone for sending in all sorts of really fantastic questions. And we encourage you to keep them coming in. We'll try and tackle as many as we can in the next 12 or so minutes. And the first question is directed to Emily from New Forests. And so the question, Emily, for you is, now that you guys at New Forests have gone through that scopes 1, 2, and 3 measurement process, what do you wish you had known before you got started?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there are two things that come to mind from the asset management side. The first one being, having a better understanding of what primary data is available from our property managers who are on the ground, and how challenging is it for them to access that data. So for us, for example, when we think about scope 3, we need a lot of harvest transport information, distances, harvest volumes, things like that. And while that's readily available, there might be other pieces of that process, maybe around processing or where those products are ending up that our managers might not have. So we had to go through a process with our property managers on the ground to understand what data they had available. We did a survey with them, and we also did a pilot process with a manager from each of our regions under management that helped us just get a better understanding and helped to narrow down sort of the focus of our tool. The other thing I'd add is, I think we went into our scope 3 process with a bit of trepidation because it is a bit more ambiguous and the guidance may be a little less clear in some instances. And I think, something we learned along the way is that we were able to group our different assets that we manage into 4 different types based on asset type and region. And we weren't really sure we'd be able to do that before we went out into this process. And it definitely simplified it for us and made it less of a lift. So I think looking for those opportunities to streamline scope 3 where possible was something we learned along the way.
That's great. Thanks so much, Emily, for sharing those thoughts. And it definitely resonates with what we heard as well throughout this data collection process, as we got to engage with a whole bunch of impact investors who are also trying to figure out the best way to sort of manage and find that concept of scope 3 as they looked at their individual investments. So thank you for that. I think our next question is targeted at Bervi at HCAP. And the question is really around the carrot agreement structures, Bervi, that you were describing a little bit earlier. And what some folks are wondering is if the carrot agreement requires management to pay into that bonus pool, is there a risk of providing a disincentive to management to achieve the quality job improvements? Any thoughts from your end?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we the reason we ask for sort of management and ownership to contribute to the carried agreement is that, it's a matched sort of program. And so, we want, by and large, the companies in which we invest, we've done a lot of work to vet that, these management teams understand the business case for investing in quality jobs. Oftentimes we're the first institutional capital into businesses. So these are really founders that are taking on, institutional capital. And so very much sort of aligned with investing in their workforce. And, this is not meant to sort of disincentivize management teams to make improvements in job quality. I think on the flip side, because these agreements are funded post a certain financial return threshold, there are sort of significant returns for everyone around the table there. And so in a way, it's sort of meant to help align everyone to kind of get a great financial outcome, and then also, invest in the low to moderate income earning employees in a values aligned way.
Thanks for that, Verbi. And I'll follow up here with another question that's come in related to those bonuses. And so the question is, if the bonuses to workers are dependent on the achievement of those impact KPIs, what incentive do they have to honestly report? And just thinking about the fact that if they report any positive change, there will be the bonus. So how do we ensure validity of that reporting?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the reporting is very sort of detailed. So some of the reporting is actually done by us at HCAP. And so again, this goes to sort of the concept of, the data burden. There is just so much data that we ask for. And so what we've done is we have directly integrated into the HR system for many of our portfolio companies. And so we pull that data. So we are using sort of raw data from HR systems. So, that sort of prevents portfolio companies from just, kind of giving us aggregate data, which might sort of could get, a little bit more massaged, so to speak. We're really looking at raw data and running the analysis ourselves. And then the second component of it is that, we are asking for this data and reporting to be included in our board packages. So there's also a sense of accountability to your board as well around, the validity of the data. And so we're trying to kind of be very thoughtful around how we collect and measure that data to make sure that, we're not just receiving, very polished data sets.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Verbi, for sharing that detail. And I'll mention that we have the spotlight for HCAP that talks all about the carrot structure agreements in the report. So definitely feel free to take a look at that as well for folks who have a couple more questions. Going back to you, Emily, and thinking again about those Scope 3 emissions, I think it's a common topic of interest amongst this group. The question here is really about how New Forests verifies and conducts quality assurance of the data. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, a lot of the Scope 3 emissions data is often scattered and unstructured, and a lot of companies aren't necessarily using very structured methodologies to make up for that. And so any thoughts on that front?
Yeah, definitely. That's certainly something that we've been thinking about now that we have the full emissions picture. So in our last data collection process, we just checked the data internally. It was, myself, other members of our operations teams, and really just trying to work with our property managers on the ground to make sure their inputs were correct. Now that we have Scope 3 in there, we want to add more robustness, and we're working on producing a technical methodology document that'll not only guide our processes internally, but could be used for external assurance and verification. And we're aiming to do a pre-assurance process for our greenhouse gas emissions data, hopefully, within the next couple months. That's kind of our next step is seeing where are we right now? Like, could we go through an external audit of this process? And then what gaps do we need to fill in terms of outlining our methodology in more detail? So definitely something we're thinking about and working on.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Emily. And one more follow-up question for you on that front. Folks are curious to know how New Forest's methodology and accounting is considering the amount of forest hectares lost to the cutting of trees and that subsequent release of carbon.
Yep, so we're capturing from any harvest that's happening, we're capturing all the emissions associated with that harvest. And that includes contractor emissions, transport, et cetera. So we think that is a pretty holistic way of capturing emissions associated with harvesting. We haven't included any illegal sort of deforestation that might be happening on the fringes of investments, and that is something that we've thought about, but wasn't really within the scope of our first take at scope 3. So that's something we are thinking about, but we believe that within sort of our operations that we're managing currently, when harvests are taking place, our scope 3 adequately covers the emissions associated with that.
Great, thanks for that, Emily. Hopping over to the Quality Jobs Impact Performance Report, we've got a question in here around how is living wage defined for this purpose? And so Ben, I'll turn over to you for that question.
Sure. Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and certainly was really interesting to sort through. So for living wage, we tracked it to 2 benchmarks. The first was MIT's locality-specific living wage levels. That's within the U.S. And the second is the Global Living Wage Coalition's calculations, and that covers a broader region. So it's closer to global. Now, those two don't cover all geographies, and obviously there's a lot of difference between how living wage can be defined in different areas, but those two cover a lot, and they were the strongest calculations that we were able to find for this study.
Great, thanks, Ben. And a quick follow-up question on that one. A couple of people are noting that a lot of developing countries, including India, don't necessarily support that concept of a living wage, which is definitely something that we came across in the research as well. And really there, the focus is on minimum wage. And so is there any part of that 73% of the respondents in the research study located in India?
So 27% of those were located in South Asia, with a majority of those in India. So yes, and it's still a challenge trying to get data across this full sample, but we definitely did have a good share of data from that region. Yes.
Great, thanks, Ben. I know that we're bumping up against time here, and so what I might do is sneak in one more question, Bervi, for you before we do a very quick wrap up. And so the final question, as related to HCAP, is someone is curious to know how HCAP responds to criticism that might arise around managers exiting investments in a shorter time frame.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a challenge that we have, right? A quality jobs impact framework, I think in many ways you need a longer runway for, because it takes time to implement these policies and benefits to improve job quality. And it's been a pretty frothy M&A market in the US, and so we have seen a pretty quick turnaround for many of our investments. But what we hope and what we do see is that when we are exiting the work that has been done from a quality jobs framework around, employee recruiting and retention, reduced turnover, higher engagement, are often key points that are shared with prospective buyers when we exit. And it is, institutionalized in many ways within the organization. And so we hope that those practices do carry forward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Verbi and Emily, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone on the line. We've had such a pleasure getting to share some of these insights with you. And we're just so grateful that you have joined us today, and really for all of the work that you do for the impact investing community. The slide deck and a recording of this session will be available afterwards and posted on the Iris Plus website. So stay tuned for an email, and we'll be sure to get that information to you. And if any other thoughts or questions, certainly feel free to reach out to any of us on the GIIN side, and we would love to engage further. Thank you all so much again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.